I will bring forward a new plan for Britain.
The Burnham government has arrived, and it is markedly different to its predecessor. It's less stilted and less high-handed, cannier about political presentation, and determined to communicate an overarching vision. So Burnham, who gave his first Downing Street speech without notes, is already doing well. And that speech promised a circuit breaker with the past 40 years. Notably, it committed to end rough sleeping and to deliver a 10-year plan to renew Britain and reform its troubled politics. For the time being, at least, it also feels like the mood of the country is with him, if impatient, for quick change. As when all governments come into contact with reality, it has already begun to disappoint some of its most enthusiastic backers and those who had invested unqualified hope in it. Much of this has turned on the question of who would be Chancellor, with supporters of both Ed Miliband and Shabana Mahmood interpreting the eventual choice, John Healey, as a snub. For some, Burnham's cabinet choices indicate a kind of caution, pushing somewhere a little to the left of Gordon Brown. For others, they indicate a political professional intending to drive through his preferred changes as quickly as possible with a team he can, mostly, rely on to do what he wants. Now, what will those changes be? Political journalists have got used to being pretty sceptical about devolution, but Burnham is clearly serious about it and has rapidly moved to set up Number 10 North, and he pointedly greeted his old ally, Steve Rotherham, currently Mayor of Liverpool, at Downing Street. Skeptics say the centralised British state exists for a reason, and altering it will eat political capital and money, both of which are pretty scarce. A trifecta of concerns, council housing, devolution and care, have characterised Burnham's early political interventions, and it's perhaps not accidental that those are also concerns of Angela Rayner, now returning to cabinet. There are, however, difficulties looming on the horizon. Burnham doesn't have 5 years. There's little room for experiment or error. Polling bounces may prove transient. Pledges not to raise taxes are going to be strained, perhaps to breaking point. Starmer and Reeves have left him with a commitment to reduce spending in the last 2 years of this parliament. This autumn's budget will be difficult. Starmerite MPs vow, somewhat comically, their revenge. The last government began to destroy its relationship with MPs over welfare reform, and that still remains a third rail for Labour politics, and the second part of the Milburn review into just that question is due. You're listening to On Politics on the LRB podcast. I am James Butler, and joining me in the studio at this turning point in British politics are two political journalists very, very well placed to tease apart the many strands of Burnhamism. Stephen Bush, columnist and associate editor at the Financial Times, where he also writes the Inside Politics newsletter, and Sienna Rodgers, deputy editor at The House magazine, where she's most recently published an excellent deep dive into Burnham's Number 10 North initiative. Welcome both. It's good to have you in the studio.
Thanks for having us.
Can I start, Stephen, with you and with my sort of brief introduction there? Did anything surprise you in the speeches that Burnham has given so far? So that set-piece speech in the North and in Downing Street?
The thing which surprised me most was not actually anything he said, where these were very much kind of core Andy Burnham preoccupations of the kind that he's returned to a lot over his time as Mayor of Greater Manchester. I have been surprised, actually, at how much he's visibly thought about the structure of Whitehall and what he wants to do, which is not something I, to be honest, had expected. He's very much is a late convert, relatively speaking, to devolution. He was slightly sceptical of the creation of the devolution of health to the Greater Manchester area when he was Shadow Health Secretary. He did slightly become Mayor of Greater Manchester as his way of kind of going, I'm just going to duck out of the Labour Party internal wars until this Corbyn thing has resolved itself one way or the other. And so I've been quite surprised at how much he clearly has thought a lot about the centre of power and how you would change it, and not just about how you'd give away some of its responsibilities.
Yeah, same actually. That's a really good point. I was thinking nothing about his speeches have surprised me, but you're completely right. I was having conversations with people who very much intend to influence this government, and a lot of them are very interested in kind of machinery of government changes, and we were kind of saying, not sure how much Andy's interested in this stuff, and it turns out he's very interested in this stuff. It's become completely core to his mission.
I've been struck by the what feels like the presence of someone like Sam Friedman and his book on reform of government lurking somewhere behind some of these arguments. I was also quite struck, I think, and it's not necessarily surprising, but by the commitment to end rough sleeping in that speech. Now that is it's an interesting one. I mean, partly because it's probably deliverable, or something close to it is probably deliverable. It was, of course, achieved. Or almost achieved by the Blair government. But it was also the commitment that Corbyn revealed that he would have said on day one if he had ever entered into government. And that feels like something that can bring the Labour Party together. It's exactly the kind of thing that lots of strands of Labour would like to see achieved. But it also seems to me that it's something that is very aware of the retail side of politics, right? It's something people complain about. People complain about rough sleeping in cities. They say, look, the social fabric is clearly tearing. I don't think anyone who walks around London can fail to notice that there's more rough sleeping than there was in the very recent past. So there's something canny, but also there's something internally and externally directed there. Is this a sign that he has more of a sense of retail politics than someone like Starmer?
I mean, it would be hard to have less of one. I think Andy is, for good and for ill, someone who has a great grasp of symbolism and does a lot of what I think of walking around leadership. When you are the mayor and you make sure that you walk around, you go, okay, what is happening in my city centre? I was actually reminded of once being on the road with Andy Street, the former mayor for the West Midlands, where I got slight stress flashbacks to when I worked in retail, because he stopped at an underpass and did the exact same thing that the company director would do, where they go, oh, well, we haven't priced that up properly. What are we doing there? And I think Andy is someone who does really get, precisely as you say, and it's something which unites every wing of the Labour Party, but also for most voters, whether you fear that you will become a rough sleeper yourself, or if you just don't like it and it makes you feel that the social fabric is tearing apart, it makes you feel unsafe in your area. I think he has an eye for things that, if you do them, are a good proof of concept. Because, of course, the average person, unless you have school-aged children or you are in some form of crisis, doesn't actually get a lot of visible state. We only experience the failure of it. So I think it shows his eye for that kind of thing.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think people were a little bit surprised about the ending rough sleeping pledge because it didn't work in Greater Manchester. Of course, he made the same pledge and it didn't happen. And the kind of explanation that comes back for that is, well, that's because different areas were doing different things and actually you need it all to be joined up, which rather undermines his case for devolution. But anyway, I think it's a really good thing that he can spot those easy wins. I mean, his whole first week was all about identifying things that are not very expensive and actually you can just announce. And yes, there was a little row over funding because of Darren Jones making his sort of argument about how his own policy was unfunded and therefore it was bad that Andy Burnham's policy was unfunded similarly. But his whole first week really showed that he has a kind of sense of the public mood that Keir Starmer clearly very much lacked. And I wouldn't be surprised if he does spend a little bit more time in London. I've always thought I would love to take him to Willesden Green just to show him the failures of London boroughs and show him that the kind of visible deprivation and state failure that you can see in London, things like, obviously rough sleeping, drug users, just crime everywhere, but also just things like, it's very sort of Aaron Bastani style centrist dad kind of politics of just like, Lime bikes, for example. Those kind of easy wins where it's like, just do something. And the way that people will react to that will be so positive, I think.
Aaron will be delighted to have been called a centrist dad. It's very good for him. Obviously, the most eye-catching thing that has happened is the Number 10 North initiative. And it's been greeted, I think, relatively warmly, but with some reservation. I wonder if you could tell us, Sienna, it seems to me that the most obvious concern that emanates from Whitehall is the risk of dual and competing power centres. How plausible is it that that can be avoided?
There are so many issues with the Number 10 North thing. I think, it's really interesting that when I was speaking to the IFG, who obviously think about this stuff a lot, they made the point that usually with this kind of project, the concern is it will become a kind of a backwater, it will become irrelevant, basically. And as you say, actually the main concern this time is that there are competing and overlapping powers that become problematic. How to tackle that? I mean, clearly Andy Burnham has decided to be a very domestically focused Prime Minister and has decided to wrest power away from the Treasury and keep it in Number 10. And a lot of that kind of political and strategic work is going to be based in Number 10 North. I mean, we'll come on to, I suppose, the question of appointments, but it's all tied up in the same question, which is, you know, why did he go for John Healey? Well, he went for John Healey because either Ed Miliband or Shabana Mahmood would clearly have presented an alternative power base that was unacceptable to his agenda. And first of all, when we were kind of discussing, oh yeah, they're going to go for Shabana instead of Ed because of this problem, I just kept saying, I don't understand your logic here. Why do you think Shabana Mahmood is more of a pushover? That's insane. But I feel rather sorry for John Healey. I don't know what you think, but he's clearly, I mean, Burnham's going to go out on the front foot announcing all this stuff. He's decided he's got a whole kind of list of things that he's going to announce. And John Healey's job is just to somehow find the money for it all and not have much say in the fun bit of announcing cool stuff.
I'm showing that I've spent too long in journalism, but it does feel like the vision Andy Burnham has for John Healey is of the managing editor whose job it is, after someone goes raises for everybody, to come back out and go, I actually meant raises for very few people. I'm sorry, you know, my hands are tied, etc., etc. Now, I think the interesting thing is that prime ministers always have rival courtiers. Just you know, partly because you will always have the person whose job it is to advise on policy, the person whose job it is to advise on electoral strategy, the person whose job it is to care about growth policy versus the person whose job it is to care about public services. And they will all have different trade-offs. I think the question, the challenge for Andy is, can he avoid a situation where a decision gets taken in number 10 on Wednesday? He goes back, talks to a bunch of the economic policy people in Manchester and goes, oh, actually, I don't like that trade-off anymore. And can he avoid number 10 becoming this constant sort of thing where everything is provisional because the two hubs are at war with one another? I think that I'm sceptical about some of the Whitehall reforms. I think is very exciting. The one I'm sceptical about is this idea that he will successfully manage to curb the power of the Treasury. I think Sienna's exactly right. And this idea that Shabana would have been a more user-friendly or indeed a more market-friendly chancellor than Ed Miliband was a little bit like, I did kind of wonder if the people talking about had ever met Shabana Mahmood or heard anything she believed.
Well, I think they kind of hadn't, actually.
Yes.
And it was all very last minute, and apparently was a meeting with Shabana Mahmood where they actually talked to her about what she'd be like as Chancellor, and then realised, oh, that's not what we want at all. And this was very last minute. So that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
But isn't this a confusion that often happens with the Labour Party, where someone's pegged as having sort of relatively conservative social views for the Labour Party and therefore is taken to necessarily have market-friendly, pro-free trade, pro-globalisation views? And actually Mahmood represents a sort of change in you know, a very visible strand within Labour politics, but a change within politics as a whole, which is a move towards an increasingly protectionist, relatively sort of autarkic or isolationist, sceptical about the benefits of global free trade. And that's visible on right and left. But, you know, I think it's her part of the sort of broad left. It goes very unaccounted for.
It's also not just conflating where she stands on social policy and economic policy, but it was also she herself was kind of promoting herself as a kind of fiscal hawk. But there is nuance within that, which is exactly as you say, when she takes this kind of blue Labour view, you know, promoting reindustrialisation, this sort of thing, protectionist kind of values, while at the same time recognising the importance of the fiscal rules.
Yeah, one of the slightly strange things about the way a lot of people talk about the Labour Party is this strand that you described, which, let's face it, actually is the dominant strand of Labour governments most of the time they're in office, has sort of been completely forgotten, to the extent that lots of people seem to think, I think it's partly, and a lot of people in the Labour Party have a kind of, businesses are a bit mean, therefore you're pro-growth and market-friendly when you do or say mean things. Shabana is mean to immigrants, ergo she will also be pro-market, when it's a bit more complicated than that. In some ways she both represents, you say, this very modern, very now tilt across politics towards protectionism, but also she's a little bit the kind of creature from the crypt, this kind of old Labour right economics, which, has led Labour to such great electoral successes as 1979, 1955, 1959. And it seems to like when Andy Burnham and James Purnell actually heard it, they're like, oh, wait a second, we don't like this at all. But yeah, I think we'll have a lot more to say about John Healey. But it's not clear to me whether or not in the end they will just end up essentially having gone like, oh, we've recreated the Reeves Chancellorship with a slightly smaller power base. But ultimately, the Chancellor is the one who has to find the money from somewhere, which does give them a lot of power, even if you have a souped-up Office of the Prime Minister.
Let's get into those appointments, because I think determining the sort of political complexion of the government is only possible by sort of reading through those. And I think the general consensus view is the new Chancellor of the Duchy, Lou Hay, is now suddenly very powerful within Burnham circles. I mean, she certainly has been going around telling people that she is. And her sort of strand of Labour politics seems to be pretty well represented within that sort of new front bench. What exactly is that strand of politics?
I think I would characterise it as the kind of modern soft left, sort of active industrial strategy of the kind she set out in her renewal essay, of a kind of, in some ways, quite Milibandy style. The most interesting decision this government has taken is going, okay, look, the trade-off is who is the most qualified person, regardless whether you agree with him politically, to be Chancellor of the Exchequer within the Labour Party, Parliamentary Labour Party. It said Miliband. But if you do that, you're accepting you've outsourced a lot of political power, and then they're essentially casting around, being like, there is someone who's been in the Treasury but does not have their own power base, and it's John Healey. And so I think she, in that kind of Milibandite without Miliband bit of the Labour Party, is, I think, where the intellectual energy and lifeblood of this government ultimately comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally she'd be described as soft left, but obviously that's far too general a term. I mean, she's part of this kind of clique of women who are very much have a very strong relationship with the trade unions and specifically GMB, and I think that's really formative. She's also the most important thing about her is she is an incredibly talented organizer, and we've seen that. I think one of the under-discussed things about Andy Burnham's first set of appointments, is the fact that everyone loves talking about, because they probably are WhatsApped by them more, the Starmer loyalists being disappointed and angry about being left out. Why is Darren being left out? Why has he even gone so far as to sack Nick Thomas-Symonds, this sort of thing? But actually, the more interesting one, I thought, was the Labour left being left out, and not just the Socialist campaign group, but the mainstream MPs. And you saw them sidelined really as soon as we got past the kind of local elections, after the Gorton and Denton failure where he was blocked from standing. And then Louise Hay kind of came in, and Annalise Midgley and those kind of MPs, and actually got the job done. So in a way, were rewarded for that success, and understandably so. But the mainstream kind of opinion now, and some of the MPs who are sort of SEG aligned, so maybe not necessarily actually active members at the moment, because a lot of them have ditched it, but some of the new left, the kind of people where, Clive Lewis and those kind of people, where you would have expected actually for them to get some love in this government, they have clearly been completely overlooked in these appointments. They're not even PPSs. And why is that? And what does that mean for his government? There is a view that the anger on that side of things is, well, actually, Burnham, these Johnny-come-latelys are fair weather friends, basically. And they've been on board with the project since maybe end of March. It's really not long enough to be treated so kind of valued so highly by Burnham. Why is he relying on them so much? And actually his true friends, the people he really could have relied on, he has just put two fingers up to, in the words of one MP.
Yeah, so just to catch listeners up on terminology, mainstream is the relatively new grouping,
yes,
sort of intellectually, contains people like Neil Lawson, a strong kind of intellectual push behind Burnham from the soft left, and elements of the hard left as well. Those two distinctions probably, I think, increasingly irrelevant to Labour politics. They're now so old that most people forget they sort of started in 1983. I think it's perhaps less relevant now. And then SCG's Socialist Campaign Group, that would be the much harder sort of end of the irreconcilable end of the party, as it were. And obviously these boundaries are all a bit porous. There doesn't seem to me to be any sort of coherent list of SCG MPs. It sort of seems to blur a bit around the edges.
Yeah, people keep falling off that list.
Yeah. But that is interesting, right? In that, so Hay comes out of a sort of trade union-y, northwestern-y background, although her constituency is not in the northwest. But that's her background, and that's quite a sort of strongly sceptical of net zero. Like sceptical of the effect on jobs. That's particularly a GMB thing, but Unite has been very vocal about the dangers of sort of rapid ecological change, a rapid sort of pursuit of net zero and its effect on jobs. It's been very sceptical about Ed Miliband's drive in that way. So there's obviously that sort of link going on there.
What people on the Labour left might call workerism.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose, I guess my question is, Ed Miliband can't be appointed as Chancellor. He's been given Foreign Secretary. That's probably going to be quite a substantial portfolio for him to get to grips with. My judgment is that Andy Burnham isn't that interested in foreign affairs. That will probably be a change to the role of the Prime Minister as it's been conceived in recent years. But his successor at his previous department is Miata Fahnbulleh. And, she's a very serious person. She's obviously in the Milibandite sort of camp and tradition. So there's not going to be a huge change, as far as I can see, in the government's position on climate change and the necessity of net zero. It's still a very popular thing among Labour voters as well. So does that mean that you're going to see a sort of Unite GMB-friendly government maybe able to do a kind of Nixon goes to China thing to the trade unions and say, look, we're your people, you can trust us, but we're going to continue to pursue this? Or is that just fantasy on my part?
I think we don't know yet how much agency we should attribute to Miata Fahnbulleh. I mean, on the face of it, actually, so Ed Miliband, obviously it was a blow to him that he wasn't appointed Chancellor as expected. I mean, there was a lot of campaigning around it. It didn't happen in the end. Clearly, Louise Haigh had a big say in that. But he is in the Foreign Office, and already we've seen from his first pronouncements as Foreign Secretary that he's basically treating it as like Desnes goes abroad. He's talking about, the climate crisis, and this is his kind of top priority. And he's got his main ally running Desnes now, and a lot of the junior ministers are the same. He's got Polly Billington, obviously strong Miliband ally who used to work for him, etc. So actually, he's not done badly out of this situation at all. We don't know, I think, so far, whether Miata will take a different approach to everything she's ever said about her brief. It seems unlikely, right? But yeah, what do you think, Stephen? Do you think she'll actually surprise us and be more moderate than on Desnes stuff that anything kind of suggests that she will be?
I doubt it. I mean, I think there are a variety of ways you can finesse the position on net zero. So, for example, you can say, sure, fine, we'll issue more licenses, but the tax take is not going to go down. The challenge for British energy policy is that we are, because of where we're located physically in the world, because the price of solar is dropping faster than the price of wind, we look at the moment set to be one of the last countries to properly stop using gas, but also one of the first countries to stop getting any tax revenue on the collection of it. And so you can see why some people in the government go like, hang on a bit, like we should finesse this a bit, which I think is the most likely place they're going to end up on. Because the other interesting thing I think about where Ed has ended up is, what are the issues that have caused a major rupture on Labour's left flank? It is, one, not being sufficiently robust in the face of the rise of racism. Two, it's Gaza. And what are the things that we know Ed Miliband has been an involuble internal critic outside of his own brief? Well, those are two of those things. And of course, Gaza is the one which is more relevant within his department. But yeah, I suspect that actually when push comes to shove, energy policy won't change all that much, not least because all of the options are really expensive. And one of the problems, as you alluded to earlier, they have inherited this insane spending timetable, where Rachel Reeves essentially went, what I want to do is I want to do all of the difficult spending and tax decisions in the election year, rather than the traditional thing where you do it 5 years from the election year and then you have an easy budget going into it.
And the rhetoric was completely the opposite of that. The whole thing was kind of baffling. It's as if they perfectly designed it for this timeline of Keir's premiership to end in mind. It's just mad.
Yeah, it's just this way that they would keep talking about, we've made the tough decisions. Like, no, you haven't. And we can all read it on black and white, and you haven't on the gov.uk website. Whereas, this thing is, if you had wanted to design a situation where, okay, I'm going to have a 2-year premiership, and then it's going to be a horrible mess for my successor, you go, okay, yeah, that's essentially what I would do. But that clearly wasn't the plan. Keir Starmer's still talking about, I've left things in a good position for my successor, which he very much hasn't. But he clearly does at some level believe is, I think, one of the more mystifying subplots in Labour politics of recent years.
And on the energy secretary thing, also just to note, I haven't confirmed this myself, but there was a report that Miatta Fahnbulleh was not first choice, and they tried to give it to Lisa Nandy, who didn't want it and ended up staying at DCMS, which stakeholders will have maybe actually not so mixed views about.
Yes.
But interesting that they were trying to go for Nandy instead.
I mean, I think it's probably worth saying to people listening to this, I think, as you suggest, I don't know anyone who works in any cultural industry who has seen hide nor hair of Lisa Nandy in her role. And it's a fairly important job, in fact. I mean, it's a significant British export industry, the culture industry as a whole, from conventional media through to something like video games, massive part of British output, really, really important. You might also think that we're entering an era where politics is communicated, as Andy Burnham clearly knows, through a form of sort of unregulated media, a sort of instant television that arrives in your pocket. Perhaps a culture secretary might have something to say about that. But she is nowhere to be seen. That's actually a real problem.
Yeah, the thing she and her supporters club have clearly successfully convinced Andy Burnham and his circle of is, she had a bunch of things she wanted to do as culture secretary, but she was stopped by Downing Street, which, I mean, it feels to me implausible that Keir Starmer, a prime minister who for most of his time in office, this is not an exaggeration, this is literally for 10 months of the 24, you had the Treasury and the Ministry of Defence going, we've got a dispute and you need to adjudicate between us. And he was going, well, why can't you settle this among yourselves? But we're being asked to believe that he was actually using his time and energy to stop Lisa Nandy doing the things she apparently wanted to do. But also it's unclear to me why, if she was being stopped from doing things, she couldn't at the very least take the time to make the stakeholders feel better about themselves. Yeah. And that really does range from sort of high to middle to low to lowbrow culture. Yeah, I've heard stories from essentially I've heard this story about a Harry Styles concert, a BBC prom, and then a event that I'm not going to name in the north of England because it would be far too obvious who I got it from, in which she turned up, watched a thing, looked bored, left early. And you think, well, Keir Starmer wasn't making you do that. And it is strange, not least in addition to all of those things. One of the most consequential things this government is going to tackle is possibly the last charter renewal in the era of the BBC, when the TV licence is its main funding source, and they will have to make important decisions about how to safeguard public service broadcasting into the rest of the 21st century. And some would argue that it would be good to have a culture secretary who hadn't treated it like it was some kind of punishment detail for the past 2 years. One of the weirder things about this new government, it's not obvious from the outside, when you think about what the various ministers in it believe, what Andy Burnham thinks the problem of the last 2 years actually was.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's also, it brings us to an interesting question, actually, which is that I still find it hard to quite place the political direction of the government from reading the sort of tea leaves of which appointment is where. And now that's obviously partly because any prime minister has to sort of balance sort of internal critics and, reward allies. And it's not always, you don't always get exactly who you want where. One thing we haven't mentioned, for instance, is the near total sort of expulsion of any Wes Streeting allied person other than Streeting himself from government. I thought that was actually pretty surprising and quite bold move. But I think the Treasury is probably the central question here. And, I'm aware that Healey comes from a sort of Brownite background. He was sort of Treasury Minister under Brown. So that's his that's his political centre. He was, at the time, of course, he advocated for more social housing. So is it plausible to read the general political tone of this government as a sort of left wing of Brownism?
I think you could make that argument, but I do think that it might be trying to make it more coherent than it actually is. It might be just a little bit too forgiving. I think it is mainly defined by who is excluded rather than who is included. And some people will say, well, that's people that Louise Haig doesn't like. Other people will say, it's Starmerites or it's, kind of anyone on the left or hard soft left or whatever, or soft hard left. It is mostly about exclusion rather than inclusion. And just many of the appointments, Lisa Nandy is one example, but so many of them, they are square pegs round holes. I think there was quite a few where their first preference clearly hasn't ended up with the person who's been appointed to that role, and that's evident because just so many of them don't make sense.
Yeah, I think so. I partially agree with you, but I think the striking thing, exactly as you say, James, is that the big set of exclusions were everyone allied to Wes Streeting, which means that the one thing which is firmly different from the last government, although obviously the Keir Starmer government was not economically liberal, but it had sort of several economically liberal people in it, sort of there, kind of doing faces like they were in a hostage video. That strain of Labour thought has been completely expunged. Now, that might be, as you say, partly about who happens to have fallen out with whom, but it does still nonetheless mean, I think, where this government will resolve will be in that left of Brown. This will be the government that Gordon Brown now pretends that he wanted, rather than the one the kind of, I never said all of those things about what drives growth or free markets. Yeah, this is kind of the Brown in retirement government rather than the Brown actually in the Treasury one, is I suspect where they will end up a little bit by default, because exactly as Sienna says, it is a weird government, right down to the fact that usually when you look at a government, the way to read it, I think, is the Minister of State ones, because that's where the Prime Minister thinks their next generation and their successor will come from. We saw that with Keir Starmer's first shadow cabinet, where he had this broad sort of unity, I'm all things to all people. And you looked at the Ministers of State and you went, it doesn't look like you're all things to all people. It looks like this is a project of the old right and the Blairites. And you look at this and you go, look at the cabinet and go like, that's a bit weird. What's going on there? But then there's not an obvious degree of greater clarity in the Minister of State roles, or indeed, to take a politician who is market friendly, Emma Reynolds at the Chief Secretary. Well, usually Chief Secretary is partly where you place someone who you hope will one day become a candidate for Prime Minister, because it gives them a huge overview of the whole of government. And it's quite hard to place what the political identity of a government which goes, I want John Healey as Chancellor, Emma Reynolds as Chief Sec, Miata Van Buller at Energy. That is just a bit odd, even before some of the more eccentric positions in some of the delivery departments.
Yeah, and it's like, he... obviously, they had been talking about this, he will appoint a government of all the talents and this idea, but he's neither done that nor has he done something that politically is cogent. So it kind of falls between the two.
The instinct of successful politicians within the Labour Party is often to point to something where something has gone wrong and a mistake that they want to unwind. For lots of people on every wing of the party, that's Thatcherism. And, of course, Burnham promised a circuit breaker with 40 years of error. That period, of course, includes governments that he was part of. And I think that's really interesting. I think that I don't think it's implausible to think that while he's been away in Manchester, he's spent some time thinking about maybe what he might have done differently when he was in government. I think he's given some indications that he might think that way. But one of the things that often worries me about Labour politicians is that they think it's somehow possible to go back and undo everything, as if, you could reincarnate yourself in 1992 or 1979 or indeed 1997. That doesn't seem plausible to me. What's Burnham's understanding of how society has changed, both for better and worse, since 1979?
One of the weird things about New Labour and the politicians that emerged from it is that Tony and Gordon did have this very finishing school model of it, of you are going to be a public policy person, you are going to be an economic person. And I think you're entirely right to see Andy Burnham's ideological journey as sincere, right? Which is that your average New Labour minister essentially would have said, if you sort of dosed them up on truth serum, we were wrong on the economic arguments in the 80s. We've got this economic model which works and it allows us to do a bunch of redistribution. And then the intellectual argument in the Labour Party after the financial crisis is, okay, so do we need to rebuild this, or is this a sign that it was a wrong turn? And Andy has clearly decided he thinks it was a wrong turn. He also thinks it was a wrong turn in terms of what I think of as distinctly Thatcherite things about the market turn. So there's the economic stuff that Thatcherism does, which happens essentially everywhere in the 1980s, whether it's the New Zealand left doing it under Rogernomics, or it's Mitterrand doing it under Fire in France, or it's Thatcher going, look, I'm going to make myself the avatar of it. But the distinct Thatcherite thing is this distaste of local government and this preference of quangos and indirect bodies running things over the directly elected bits of the state. And I would say it's striking to me that Andy Burnham is much more fluent on the public policy side, i.e. your quangos, your indirect way of running things, your centralisation, because that is the type of post he was being groomed for under New Labour. Whereas on the economic side, I'm afraid I do hear in my voice that thing Ed Miliband famously said when it was suggested he make Andy Burnham Shadow Chancellor in order to avoid putting Ed balls, and he said, in a tone of evident contempt, look, Andy can't do maths. I think your anxiety then some people have confused, well, is this a wrong turning with, well, does that mean I can transport the car back to before the turn? If we take, say, water, where I think even the most unregenerate neoliberal, as the unregenerate neoliberal on the panel, would concede has not worked, you do still have these indebted, poorly run organisations where one way or the other, whether they're run by the state or not, you have to work out what to do, not just about the mistake in 89 of privatising them, but all the mistakes that have been made in the intervening 4 decades.
I think and one interesting detail, I wonder what you guys think about this, of the appointments is obviously Kanishka as AI minister. Now, there was a lot of criticism leading up to his appointments of obviously abolishing DSIT and what does that mean for tech. I think a rather worrying thing about his government is that Andy Burnham clearly is a skeptic of all of this stuff, as something that I share with him, but he also needs to be far more interested in how to approach this thing that's going to be bigger than the Industrial Revolution. And so far, his reaction looks as if it's, well, Kanishka's very well respected by this industry, and therefore I'll let him deal with it and I'll elevate him to a cabinet position. But what's under that? Not very much. What kind of infrastructure is around that? Not very much. So that kind of, in the same way that he's not very interested in foreign policy, and maybe that strangely actually it empowers Ed Miliband to do what he likes with it. There may be a similar thing going on with AI, and does that mean that it's kind of incoherent? So I think a lot of it is about reversing kind of Thatcherism, obviously, the devolution, the decentralization, the Hillsborough stuff, all these kind of campaigns that really get him going. It's all about that. But what does he have to say about the future? I do often find it frustrating. It's the kind of tired old complaints you hear often about left governments, that they just want to recreate the 70s and they're harking back too much to the past. And his first speech as Prime Minister or as Labour leader, was it, where he very explicitly talked about the 70s, attracted the same criticisms. But I think in this case, there may be something in it, in that, this is not something exclusive to him. It's multiple governments now who just haven't actually tackled the biggest issue of our times of what the hell are we going to do about this?
I think that question of just again for listeners that this is a reorganisation of the Department for Science and Business, and various bits and pieces are moving all over the place. I mean, the bit that oddly I think hasn't moved is the universities out of education and back into the science and business end of things, which I've been sceptical about in the past, but actually it's pretty clear with the amount of change that's needed in the sort of primary and secondary education system, that tertiary education ends up being a sort of afterthought within that department. Universities are themselves in crisis. It's a very difficult time for, again, like historically quite a significant British export industry, education. Previous government not that interested in dealing with it. They sent Jackie Smith to sort of wield an axe at people, which she's very good at, but not to the great pleasure of people within the sector. But it all seems a bit messy to me. I'm not sure that there's much thought gone into this reorganisation. And as you say, this new Minister for AI position, it's taking seriously that this is a real thing. It's not clear to me where he's sitting and quite what department is he's answerable to, or that he's going to be participating. So who knows? We'll see these things play out, but it does seem like it's a recognition that it's not just a matter of undoing things, that there are things that are changing and that the government needs to be on top of. So perhaps a cause for optimism. I'm sounding optimistic. That's unusual for me.
So the House view in the Labour Party about DSIT had come to be that it was a department of boosterism, right? Then it was not able to be remotely critical of AI, which I think is a misread. And so if you think about the people who've been appointed to it, if you make Peter Kyle your Secretary of State for somewhere, you're going to get a booster. And then if you undercut someone's welfare reforms and then sort of essentially shatter their confidence, you are then going to get the kind of, the 8 months of kind of Liz Kendall's PTSD, where she didn't really seem to be doing very much. And then, exactly as Sienna outlines, Kanishka's very much like, the sector's unhappy about losing their department, but they like Kanishka, so why don't we have him be attending cabinet? I think, of course, one of the reasons why we've ended up with this slightly messy bit of Whitehall reorg is that they needed to be able to create this additional post for number 10 North, and the civil service has successfully won the argument for the idea that should come back into the centre at the Cabinet Office, which is your classic Cabinet Secretary land grab. On the one hand, I think you're right, then there is a genuine engagement with the economy that we actually have and how it actually exists. He did, for example, acknowledge the importance of universities to Manchester's transformation, which is a huge step forward on the Labour government that's just gone, which really did seem to want to exactly recreate the 1979 Labour electoral coalition and economic offer. However, it's then kind of balanced with what looks to me like a reorg that has slightly allowed itself to be shaped by the interests of the permanent state, where they've gone, you can't possibly kill off the whole of the Cabinet Office, which has both been shrunk but now has a dizzying number of cabinet ministers in it. It's got Kanishka Narayan, it's got Lou Haig, it's got Bridget Phillipson in the newly reconstituted freestanding Department for Women and Equalities, at the same time as they're going, we're also going to make this smaller and create an office of the Prime Minister. That, I think, feels like a misstep. But I think one of the things which I am optimistic about is that I think a thing we'd all got used to is that we've had essentially an anti-intellectual Prime Minister for the last 2 years and an anti-intellectual Labour leader for the last 6. And as Tony Blair himself says, politics actually is an intellectual exercise. You can't do it well if you're not interested in ideas. And Andy is interested in ideas and that, I think, will be a way this government is an improvement, because it will at the very least be a place where discussion of the United Kingdom's real problems can happen again without people looking at you funny and going, okay, but how does that play in this by-election?
Yeah, when you touched on Bridget Phillipson there, I mean, again, another example of my understanding is she was offered this in the full expectation that she would turn down such a drastic demotion, having most of her brief taken away from her and just being left with women and equalities. And she didn't. She said yes. And that was a surprise. So it's another example of just this is not exactly how they intended it all to play out. And it's all settled in quite a random way as a result.
Let's talk about constraints. And Duncan Robinson at The Economist put a piece up recently in which he argued that governments make most of their real achievements in their first 100 days or so and spend the rest of their time clearing up after the messes that they've made. I think that's arguable, but there's something to it. Obviously, Burnham is coming in midway through a parliament, so he has even less time. He's, got a substantial majority, but, parts of it are truculent. As we've mentioned, he has these really, really serious economic constraints on the horizon. And he has pressing needs to find savings or make cuts in non-ring-fenced departments. That's really, really hard to do. It's really hard to do without really annoying his backbenchers, and really hard to do without seeing probably a poll rating dip. Some people have been led to think, therefore, that what he should do is spend the next 6 months trotting out a series of kind of credibility-enhancing, cost-of-living messages, be very present, say, I am on your side, I hear the state the country's in, and then in spring of next year, call an early general election. He has said he's not going to do that. There are obvious risks to that. One of them being that, given the unpredictability of votes on the right of politics, it might make Nigel Farage leader of the opposition, which would be interesting. If he's still in Parliament at that point. But it's a real problem. And so lots of the kind of wish casting about a Burnham government doesn't seem to deal with the fact that these things, which are very, very hard constraints, are on the horizon. Stephen, could he just say, well, I'm going to break those commitments?
There's not a law of physics which prevents you doing that, but also that one of the reasons why the last government got into such a mess is indeed the reason why the Boris Johnson government got into such a mess, because we shouldn't forget that they did essentially make the same big picture promises of public services will get better, but don't worry, someone else will pay for it, is then you have to break either one of those promises, right? Then one of the slight problems for where Labour are is that they've broken the spirit of the promise, because they have increased people's taxes through the threshold change and through employers' NICs. And they've done it in a way and used so much of their fiscal firepower on the NHS, and people also don't feel like they're getting the improved public services. So I think we are still in some ways back to the situation of, okay, well, you're going to have to break one of these promises. Which one is it? One reason why I think that they may yet still actually be, that their plan A may be, let's have a good 6 months and then let's go for an election, is in addition to the constraints that they have electorally, if we think about the known unknowns of the next 3 years, the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. That is going to continue to drive up energy and food prices. Donald Trump is still president and will continue to, that will continue to have any number of negative effects. And it is set in stone in the spending plans they've inherited to have this very painful run into the election. So you can see the argument of going, we just need to find a way to realign the political cycle so that the next time we have to renew our vows with the electorate is after the end of Donald Trump's term and after the unusual spending plans that Rachel Reeves has put forward. It does often feel that a lot of people in the Labour Party, including worryingly some people around Andy, seem to think that the only problem with Keir Starmer was that he wasn't charismatic enough, and it obviously didn't help. But the bigger problem was that he had made policy choices which make it very hard to see how a Labour government, or indeed any government, can succeed within the 3 years it has. Potentially him just making people feel better about themselves and better about voting Labour is not nothing, but it's tough.
Every Tory I speak to says, I think Andy Burnham is going to announce at Labour conference that he's calling a general election. And obviously they're not the experts about it, what's going on in Andy Burnham's head. And I don't think they're right about that. But I do think they're right that an earlier election is likely. I think probably more likely in a year's time, a 2027 general election. And I think, that's partly because you either have to break your manifesto. And I believe them that I don't think they are going to be breaking with that manifesto, but I do believe that they think they can do things that were obviously not in the manifesto. And they will be trying to kind of stretch that as far as it can go. How successful they'll be with that is an interesting question. I mean, we've had these kind of reports about obviously denied by number 10, but is he going to scrap council tax and stamp duty and replace it with proportional property tax or something like that? For example, all these kind of really quite radical things that were not in the manifesto. Can he get away with those things? I think, ironically, though he's said that he's going to take a softer approach to the whip, he has the whip hand in that all these MPs who really don't want an election to be called, he can obviously say, well, look, that is the ultimate threat that he has. And the fact that Keir Starmer did not have the kind of the self-confidence to say that when the welfare bill was in so much trouble and instead had to rip it up on the floor of the House spoke to, his just inherent lack of confidence in government and created so many problems for him. So I think at once that Burnham can get things through that Keir Starmer very much couldn't, as a result of a combination of managing the party better, selling things better and being more charismatic and better at comms and all the rest of it, and this kind of really quite real threat of a general election. But I also think he is the kind of guy, I think everything suggests this so far, the kind of politician who wants his own mandate. He's going to want that, and I think he'll probably want that next year. Seems really very, very likely to me.
If you're an enterprising backbencher with one of those McSweeney majorities, so say about 1,000 or less votes, and that's quite a number of Labour backbenchers actually, but you think, okay, I've got my time in Parliament, but things are looking probably a bit dicey for me at the next election. And what's the rational approach to take to a Burnham government? Is it to sort of knuckle under and do the best to support it? Is it to sort of make your name as a sort of either a kind of informed, prominent public supporter or intelligent critic? I find it quite hard to place, and that's a reasonable chunk of the Labour Party. It
is. I mean, interestingly, Starmerites, this is kind of obvious in a way, but Starmerites who have big majorities are very comfortable, obviously, with Burnham calling an earlier election, and they kind of make the point that why would you wait for another 2-3 years for you to become just as unpopular as Keir Starmer in order to then call an election and have it go horribly wrong, rather than have a kind of reduced majority earlier, but a better situation than it would otherwise be. The point I think that is salient is that, a massive majority, a huge PLP did not help Starmer very much. And of course, that is partly because of the way he couldn't speak to people, apparently, couldn't foster any relations there. That played a huge role in that, but it didn't do him any favours. Having a slightly smaller, more coherent PLP, and even one where they would have to work more cross-party, well, all of this is something that Burnham is quite comfortable with. So, I think the disadvantages can be exaggerated.
I think the benefits of being seen to be independent-minded are always vastly overrated by MPs. But it's a thing that makes them feel like they're in control of events, so they're always attracted to it. But the Iraq War is possibly the cleanest example, right? Where Jeremy Corbyn, the head of Stop the War, the anti-war MP's anti-war MP, still has exactly the same Labour to Lib Dem swing in his Islington North constituency as everyone else's, because and we're talking also about someone diligent enough to then be able to win as an independent later, because ultimately, if you've got the party rosette next to you, you live and die with the party brand. And I think one of the problems with, as you say, the McSweeney majorities is that is loads of MPs, including ones in seats and we'd previously described as quite safe. And part of the art of parliamentary management is you have to find things where the people with bigger majorities are able to flex to let the people in marginal seats hold their seats. But because essentially everyone now thinks they're in a marginal seat because of what happened with the Gaza independence, because of what happened in London and Wales in the local and devolved elections, there is, I think, a real lack of appetite to go, oh, well, don't worry, I'll take a bath on this. But I think Sienna's exactly right that the fact that Keir Starmer was not good at talking to MPs, could not take them on a journey, couldn't ever really explain why he wanted to do something or why it might benefit them in the long term. These are things that we would basically have expected of any other Prime Minister. That I think we shouldn't be surprised if it turns out the mere fact of having someone who can do the job will, I think, probably change the mood music in the parliamentary party a lot more than we expect.
I also wouldn't underestimate the number of MPs who just checked out and actually checked out under Starmer, even being loyalists. But they're like, oh, you know what? I'm not restanding. Even ones who came in the 2024 intake, I'm not restanding. I've had enough of this already. This is not actually what I thought I was getting myself into. A lot of them just didn't understand what the role of an MP was going to be like. People who had, were council leaders, for example, or had kind of major roles, thought that it would be on a par with that, and it completely wasn't. And so there was a really kind of interesting, massive variety of reactions to being in exactly that situation of like, you're clearly not going to be re-elected. So what do? Do you try and stand for committee chair, and do you try to, show your loyalty at every opportunity, or do you just go, screw it, I'm just going to do my own thing now, I'm going to say exactly what I like? You saw all of those reactions over the last couple of years.
That's such an interesting, I mean, the difficulty in knowing what an MP's job is like, in that it says something about how bad Labour has been at renewing its sort of cadre of potential MPs, right? And that sort of renewal pipeline. I mean, it's also, I think, a question actually about this new government, about how many of that intake who've arrived while Burnham has been out of Parliament, are being sort of drawn in, in a sense, and being allowed to sort of find their feet, with a view to that 10-year plan that he's talked about. It's probably worth talking just a little bit at the end here, about the rest of the political system. And you mentioned, Sienna, that Burnham has said positive things about working cross-party. Lots of people say that when they're not in government. He's also said positive things about electoral reform. I don't think he will feel that electoral reform is constitutionally viable without being a manifesto commitment. I think he's right about that, in fact. But necessarily there are consequences for the rest of politics. So Kemi Badenoch, who is still there, has been not necessarily a brilliantly effective leader of the Conservative Party, but had begun to find a way to land some blows on Starmer, partly because Starmer was simply so lamentable in the job. It seems to me that her job has now got quite a bit harder, in fact.
It's interesting that you say that, because Tories are incredibly optimistic. I mean, they're actually cock-a-hoop at the moment. Genuinely, they're all saying, and some people in the Labour Party say this as well, but they're all saying two-party politics is back, baby. I mean, they're so excited. They think Andy Burnham's the best thing for them, and actually he's going to restore normality. He's going to, tackle the green problem and reform, or of course, I think today the latest a poll came out where they lost their lead for the first time. And it's fascinating. I think a lot of what we've been talking about will be defined by what happens in Clacton, what happens with Farage. Almost nobody in Parliament thinks he actually wants to be Prime Minister. Therefore, what are we doing here? But yeah, they're really positive about this, and they think this is all very good news for them. And I can see their logic.
Kemi Badenoch's great success as Conservative leader has been her ability to, A, get people to assess her leadership, not based on the state of the Tory party when she took it over, when it was polling at 29%, but against the state she herself drove it into. And it is really fascinating. You talk to Conservative MPs, and it is like speaking to someone from a parallel universe. They really do think it's going a lot better than it. Then you kind of go, okay, guys, there aren't a lot of places like Kensington or Aberdeen. It might be a bit of a problem that you can't seem to win outside of these quite unusual enclaves. However, Kemi Badenoch's big political gamble has essentially been, look, the Labour Party is sufficiently left-wing that I don't need to worry about losing votes to my left flank. I just need to get as close as possible to reform, and then something will turn up which causes them to collapse, which I don't think you could fairly say had been a good strategy, because she has essentially made the Conservative Party a supporting character in its own fate. However, it could work for her. But I think where you are absolutely correct is that one of the things which has lulled the Conservative Party into this state of, oh, brilliant, another successive set of local elections where we've been absolutely destroyed, has been that she does a good job of beating Keir Starmer in the House, and he does a very bad job of making her look silly, which I think is unlikely to be a thing that Andy Burnham struggles with in the same way. And that might cause a sudden change in mood music. Equally, however, this huge gamble of, I don't need to have a strategy to tackle Farage, someone else will do that for me, might turn out to be correct. I think the party we never name, right? The fact that the Lib Dems have completely vanished from the political discussion, I think sooner or later that party is going to start having a bit of a freak out, because they're going to be asking themselves, okay, if we go into an election and it polarizes on to keep Labour and get rid of Labour or stop whatever's going on the right, what is our position? I think is going to become more and more alarming to them. But I think the interesting challenge for everyone is that they've all grown used to then being a void where a prime minister should be. And in different ways, whatever one thinks about the direction Andy Burnham wants to take Labour in, there being a direction again is going to be something that everyone else in politics has to readjust to.
And if you're Zach Polanski, are you crying into your muesli?
Well, we've already seen, just in the days before the Makerfield result came out, Labour sources were really depressed about this upcoming mayoral by-election in Greater Manchester, going, oh God, it's going to be awful, it's going to be so painful, it's going to be Greens versus Reform. And they were completely wrong and completely changed their tune in this very, very sudden way. And it's like now, the Greens are expected to come second, but sort of who cares? Reform obviously nowhere to be seen because of the Clacton issue. The kind of mood, the expectations and the reality changed so quickly. The Greens have already been sidelined in this whole story. Obviously, their response is, well, look at the appointments he's made. Look at all of the things he's doing. He's not a repentant Blairite. He's just a Blairite, and this is going to be obvious. But they have so many problems with trying to grow the party sufficiently to meet their kind of polling status. And you see that with their choice of candidate in Greater Manchester. It doesn't align with the Polanski message at all. So it hasn't really worked, and they're going to have these problems everywhere. So their ceiling is very low.
So I guess I wouldn't rule the Greens out yet. I think I suspect that at the next election, they'll have this odd situation where they will have objectively done quite well from their 2024 baseline.
Yes. But
loads of people will be talking about it like it's a defeat. In that, if we think about the places where they won power, what is the Greens' central problem? It's that a lot of their voters are terrified of a Farage-led government and will vote tactically for the Labour Party. But if you're the Labour incumbent in Holborn and St Pancras, whoever that will be, I doubt it will be Keir Starmer, if you're the Labour incumbent in Hackney North or Hackney South or in the Lewisham seats, you don't have the shield of, you might wake up to a scary Reform government. Although Keir Starmer going is a huge blow for Zach Polanski, I think the permanent foot in the door that those local elections results have got them are quite important. Who knows what will happen with the London mayoral election if Sadiq Khan doesn't decide to stand again. And so I think they do have reasons for optimism, even though their role on the national stage is inevitably going to be diminished. Because although, yes, Andy Burnham is to the right of Zach Polanski, I think we shouldn't underestimate that a lot of why the Greens did well was not about a desire particularly for that position. It was a desire to vote for someone who didn't make Labour voters feel bad about themselves. And actually, the fact that Andy Burnham is not a feel-bad politician is a problem for the Greens.
It's been pretty good for Andy Burnham so far. What's the first serious hurdle he's going to hit?
The budget in October. That is where partly because the thing is he does do that thing where he kind of goes around going, oh, we like this, oh, we support that, oh, maybe we should look again at prison techniques again. All of these things cost money. And then he also says, oh, but don't worry, we won't take it from you from that way. And John Healey, I was about to say John Healey would be tearing his hair out, but of course he won't. But John Healey is the person who then has to make this form some kind of budget, and they have to either decide, look, are we shooting for something in 27, or are we trying to avoid, are we trying to change the fiscal reality in 28-9? And I think one way or the other, that is going to be a painful moment in the life of the government.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen's right. The easiest answer is the most correct one. It is just the budget. And for some reason, he's made it even more difficult for himself by setting this aim of having a 10-year plan as well this year. So, yeah, they're going to be trying to figure all of this out while conducting this kind of staff review in number 10, while having all these people in the kind of wrong jobs. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah. For me as well, I think the Melbourne Review coming down the line is going to perhaps raise some awkward questions for him. But that, I think, is a good place for us to leave it. Sienna, Stephen, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you've enjoyed this conversation, you will, of course, enjoy reading the London Review of Books. If you go to the LRB website right now, you can read Emily Wilson on Christopher Nolan's Odysseus. And if you scroll back in your podcast feed, you can hear Emily talk to Tom Jones about that film. And in the current issue, Oliver Cusson on Marat, Jenny Turner on a Scottish literary revoluter, Neil Asherson on wartime Berlin. Thanks for listening.